to talk about Lieutenant Colonel J. Felix St. James and the Battle of Shiloh. Now, our camp was named after J. Felix St. James, and I thought maybe we ought to do a little research on him and find out who he was and where he came from and what happened during the Battle of Shiloh, and then what happened to his family afterwards. So that's what we're going to talk about. This is actually an old picture of Shiloh Church, which is what the Battle of Shiloh is named after. It's also called the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, among other things. J. Felix is born in 1829 here in St. Genevieve. We call him St. James, but his real name was St. Jem, which is an old French family. And a little bit about, this is his baptismal record. It was on December 30th that the priest baptized him. It's kind of interesting, we always call him Joseph Felix, but he was baptized Felix Joseph, which is not uncommon a lot of times. But it says he is the son of Auguste St. Jem and Felicity Leclerc actually. And the baptismal sponsors were Amadea Valley and Felicite Therese Augustine St. Jem. So that's what a burial record or a baptismal record looks like, and it's one of the great things where we see early signatures. Now, Augustine St. Jem comes from a long line of family members that actually, I think it was his, his grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Père, who came from Montreal down to Kaskaskia. Then his, Augustine's father was Jean-Baptiste Fils, or Junior, and Augustine was born about 1791, and he marries Felicity Deslay Leclerc. And they have 4 children. The first is a girl, Augustine, in 1822, and then Gustavus, who we get kind of familiar with later on here in St. Genevieve during the Civil War. He is a provost marshal, and I think he was a captain in the 47th, and eventually became kind of a historian on Civil War stuff here in town. And then Joseph Felix in 1829, and the last son is born in 1832, Augustus St. Jem. Joseph Felix, or I guess I'll just call him Felix. Felix gets married in 1853. He had already changed his name to St. James by that time, and I'm going to show you some documents earlier, but this is out of the church marriage records. Very typical of the time, and the priest is saying who he is, who his parents are, and then who he's married to, and who her parents are. And Susan E. Sargent was the daughter of Ichabod Sargent and Anstez Brown. And Ichabod Sargent was a doctor here, and he was a compatriot of Louis Fields Lynn, our famous senator. And we have their journal of their medical records down at Felix Valley. But he was from New Hampshire, and he would have probably been an abolitionist by background. But here's, typically in the church marriage records, you'll see a bunch of people signing here. This is his signature, J. Felix St. James, but you also see Felix in Odile Valley of the Menard Valley house across the street. You'll see Louis Cyprian Menard here, who ends up marrying J. Felix's sister, Augustine. Isabel Valley, there's a Waters, some of the Rosiers, Francis Rosier, I think another place there's Furman Rosier. So I mean, he's doing pretty good in 1853. Ichabod Sargent is a pretty well-known doctor, pretty famous here. And the St. Jem family is obviously one of the classic old upper-class French families. Some of the first records we see of him are in some business journals that list attorneys all over the United States. They're called the Livingston Law Journals. And in 1851 and 1852, we see him listed as St. Genevieve County, St. James J. Felix, and he's also a partner of Jesse Robbins. And Jesse Robbins' house is the house right next to mine. and he was a lawyer here. He was very prominent both as in the education system here. His father was a guy named Prospect K. Robbins, who was one of the two people that surveyed what's known as the Fifth Meridian. And one of the presidents named Prospect K. Robbins, Jesse's father, and this other guy to survey the Fifth Meridian from someplace in the swamp down in Arkansas, and it went all the way up to St. Charles, and then it went due west. And it's the survey upon which all surveys west of the Mississippi is based on. And actually, Prospect K. Robbins is buried in our Memorial Cemetery. We don't know where, but we know he's buried there. One of the things that kind of perplexed me a little bit was, why did J. Felix St. James join the Union Army? He comes from a French family. His father owned slaves. His brother-in-law, Louis C. Menard, owned slaves. His great-grandfather owned slaves. And yet, here's this guy that is more of an abolitionist than the rest of his family. I came across this case here in St. Genevieve. It's in 1854, and it was this 23-year-old Julie, a mulattress, claims that she is illegally and wrongfully held in slavery by one Melanie Callio. Julie maintains she was born of free parents in Illinois, and by the Constitution and laws of which said state she was declared free. This sounds a lot like the Dred Scott case, which started in 1846, and it gets settled in 1857 after this at the U.S. Supreme Court. But there were a number of cases similar to the Dred Scott case that were going on. I think I saw someplace about 100 of them. And yet here in little old St. Genevieve, we're kind of having those kind of struggles about people coming in, and are they free or are they not free? And evidently, she ends up, the judge agreed with her. She must have been accused of trespassing also, and that was kind of settled between the parties. So again, here's J. Felix. His father's a slave owner. His brother-in-law's a slave owner, but he is defending a mulattress as a question of slavery. Well, they had been married in 1853, and a daughter comes along pretty soon in 1854, Adeline. And this is her baptismal certificate. It's kind of amazing. They didn't really baptize her until June of 1855, and she had been born in October. But again, the sponsors here are Jules Valley and Isabella Valley. And so they're, again, pretty prominent people here in town. Unfortunately, Adeline dies within 2 years. And this is her, and she's buried in St. Genevieve Memorial Cemetery. But then they have another girl in 1860. There's quite a bit of time period there between 1854 for their first daughter and their second daughter. But Annie Isabel is born, is baptized. Again, you see here's J. Felix St. James' signature. Back then, the lawyers all like to have a really fancy signature with swirls underneath it. So she's born in 1860. Now, good old Felix is starting to have a political career in addition to being a lawyer. And in 1856, he's on the Missouri ballot as Attorney General, or up for Attorney General, but he doesn't get elected. But it's interesting that here's somebody from St. Genevieve, relatively young by this time. I mean, at 56, he's about 27 years old, 28 years old, and it's pretty impressive, I think, that he's running as a candidate for a statewide office. And in 1860, as we start getting close to the Civil War, he's nominated to establish the electoral ticket for what's known as the Black Republicans. And the Black Republicans were Lincoln's party. And they were called that because most of those were abolitionists or were pro or anti-slavery. And so here, a guy from St. Genevieve again is in a statewide office, kind of trying to figure out who's going to run on that ticket. And obviously, Lincoln does win that. And one of the things in 1861, he's still active here locally. He's part of a group of, I mean, this is like a who's who of St. Genevieve that establishes our first St. Genevieve Library Association. And there was another library association about 1906, and then in the 1930s when the bicentennial was coming along, there was another one. In fact, our museum was half library and half museum when it opened in 1933. But you still, the Louis C. Menard, his brother-in-law's there, Jules Janes, Conrad Ziegler, Oliver Harris was a newspaper guy, Matthew Kern, Ferdinand Rozier. I mean, all of these are heavyweights in St. Genevieve at the time. And then in 1862, his son is born. His name was August, after his grandfather. And again, his brother-in-law and his sister are the godparents of August. Look at the time period here. This is very early in 1862. I don't think, when was the first bombing of the fort down in Fort Sumter? That was about April 8th. So in 1861, but this is he had already been sent off to war when his son was born. And his father dies in February 1862. So he's off, and I'll tell you where he was at during this time period, but it had to be very traumatic for him being away from home and hearing all this news that both his son and his father died. Well, I'm going to backtrack just a little bit, and I got to thank Gary for giving me a lot of documents for this presentation on the pension of J. Felix and his wife. And I also got a lot of information from a guy named Scott Allen, who is the historian down at Shiloh Battlefield. But J. Felix is one of the first ones to volunteer here in St. Genevieve, and his brother claims he was the first to volunteer in all of southeast Missouri, and that was on August 5th. And they mustered in to what's known as the 13th Missouri in November, which mustered on November 5th, 1861 in St. Louis at what's called Benton Barracks. It was on an old fairground site, and they built a number of buildings there, and that's where they would gather. There is a picture of Benton Barracks, but it's one of the Wisconsin groups in front of it. The 13th Missouri is kind of interesting. There were two companies of it that were from Missouri, one from Illinois, and the rest came from Ohio. It originally started out as an Ohio kind of regiment. I guess the guy that was the colonel here, Colonel Crafts J. Wright. He was from Ohio. They first came to Missouri, and I think he was in the Missouri 8th, but it was all Germans, so he didn't get along too well. So he went over to the 13th Missouri, and he's the first guy. His date is August 3rd, so he was there just right before J. Felix goes into the Army. And J. Felix becomes the lieutenant colonel of the regiment. So there's underneath them will be some majors, captains, lieutenants, and corporals. So the 13th Missouri, they're getting all together in November, but right after the first of the year, January 2nd, they're ordered to Cairo, Illinois. And they go down there. We don't know if they went by boat or what, most likely, but they ended up going there. And they get involved very quickly. January 31 to February 2, they go to Smithfield, Kentucky, and then to Fort Henry, which was under siege by the Union forces. And this is Fort Henry. It's on a river, and they got involved in that battle. And the fort eventually capitulated or surrendered. And then on February 6th, they ended up staying there for a little bit after the capture. But immediately thereafter, on February 12th, they got sent down to Fort Donelson, which was the next battle or town or fort that the Union wanted to conquer. And they got there just at the end. I think they were supposed to storm Fort Donelson the next morning, and the Confederates waved a white flag and gave up the fort. And then from February 22nd to March 5th, they went to Clarksville, Tennessee, and then down to Nashville, Tennessee. So this is all leading up to the Battle of Shiloh in April. An interesting thing I found doing research, Grant sends a telegram to Colonel Wright when he's at Clarksville, and he says, tear down the walls of the forts, injure them as much as possible. And at the same time, I found a diary of a gal named Nanny Hoskins Williams, who was a Confederate girl from Clarksville, Tennessee. And she writes, one of their gunboats came up with a flag of truce on Tuesday. Of course, a white flag was raised over the town, for we had no one to try to hold the place. On Wednesday they came, General Smith, Colonels Cook and MacArthur. They behaved very well. Afterwards, Colonel Bain and Wright. The latter was a black-hearted abolitionist. Then Colonel James, who was a perfect gentleman. And after him, we had Colonel Mason. The citizen thought as much of him as good of an enemy. So evidently, our good J. Felix St. James, he was the one that was there at the time, and though they didn't have the saint in front of it, he's that perfect gentleman, or at least people think he was the perfect gentleman mentioned in this diary. Oops. And then Grant orders the 13th Missouri to Savannah and Tennessee. He says, come immediately with your command. Do not march across the country. So they came down the river and ended up there by Pittsburgh Landing. And so we're starting to get into the Battle of Shiloh. You had Grant coming down through Tennessee from the Union side. He was the Army of Tennessee. He had about 45,000 men. And then coming down from Nashville was General Don Carlos Buell, and he had about 18,000 men, and he had it's called the Army of the Ohio. Union commanders were various generals, Sherman, and this is really going to be as they appeared in the order of battle from the left, as looking towards the Union lines from the left side to the right side. Sherman was on the far left, and then you had McClernand next to him, and then Brigadier W.H. Wallace, and that's actually who the 13th Missouri was assigned to, was Wallace. And next to him you have a guy named Prentice, and we're going to hear a little bit more about him because he's sometimes called the hero of Shiloh. And then you had General Hurlbut, and then Major General Lee Wallace. And I think Wallace was the guy that ended up writing Ben-Hur later in life. Hurlbut and Wallace didn't fare too well after the Battle of Shiloh. One of the things that Shiloh was probably one of the most important battles in the South. The army of the Southern Army, the Army of Mississippi, was really at Corinth, Mississippi, but they were trying to do a surprise attack on the Union forces at Pittsburgh Landing. And it's kind of interesting that I think both Grant and Sherman got caught unawares here at the Battle of Shiloh. On April 5th, the day before the battle began, Grant telegraphs his commanding officer, General Halleck, and he says, I have scarcely the faintest idea of an attack being made upon us, but we will be prepared should such a thing take place. And there was a colonel from the 53rd Ohio. The people further down in the ranks didn't believe that the Rebs were back in Corinth. They thought they were close because there had been little skirmishes going on, cavalry people. But he warned Sherman that an attack was imminent. Sherman says, take your damn regiment back to Ohio. There are no Confederates closer than Corinth. So these guys really did not have good battlefield awareness. The Confederate forces had come up from Corinth, which is right about here, and they were commanded by Albert Sidney Johnson, and he had about 40,000 men under his command. And unfortunately, General Johnson gets shot in the leg during the battle on April 6th, and ends up, the blood fills his boot, and he ends up bleeding to death, and then General Pierre G.T. Beauregard takes over for him on April 6th. The Confederate commanders are Major General Hardee. I was wondering, is this the Hardee after which Hardee hats are named, or is that Gary's mentioned his head? Yes. That's a style of hat that I guess did cavalry officers, or was it just anybody wore a Hardee?
It was an infantry issue hat.
Okay.
Not an officer.
Next to him was Major General Polk. I guess Fort Polk was probably named after him. Then Major General Bragg, Fort Bragg, probably named after him, and Brigadier General Breckinridge. Bob, I think you could probably do Braxton Bragg imitation. Yeah.
You got to practice your pencil.
I mentioned General Prentice. He's often called the hero of Shiloh, but there's a lot of myths about Shiloh, and this is one of them. Prentice's people were amidst an area called the Sunken Road and the Hornet's Nest. And they actually get captured by the Confederates during the first day of battle. But really, the unsung hero of Shiloh is a Colonel Everett Peabody, who was with the 25th Missouri. And he was stationed kind of in the center of the line, center right of the line. And he actually sent out a little reconnaissance group about 3 a.m. of the morning of Sunday, April 6th. Now Grant had said, we don't start a fight. That's kind of why and they didn't think there was going to be a fight. He didn't think he was ready, because they really wanted to go after Corinth, Mississippi, and capture the Confederates there. Well, Colonel Peabody does send out this group, and they do engage the Confederates, and fighting starts happening. He goes back to camp, and his commanding general, Prentice, comes up and starts to berate him for causing this fight to start, and says, I'm going to hold you personally accountable for this, and then goes off in a huff. Well, Colonel Peabody is in the heat of it all during the day of April 6th. He ends up getting wounded 4 times and is killed with a headshot on the 4th one. And just before he got, at this point, the Union forces are in full retreat. He's trying to get them to turn and fight. He says, stand to it yet. Remember Lexington. He had been at the Battle of Lexington, Missouri. So he's a good Missouri guy, is really given the credit that the Union Army really didn't get totally massacred on the first day of Shiloh. Now, as the battle begins, the Confederate troops were within like 1 or 2 miles of the Union forces, and the Union forces didn't know it until that little skirmish with Peabody started. And you had, again, Hardee, Polk, Bragg, and Breckinridge here. And the Union forces are spread like this, with Sherman up on the left, and here's where Prentice is down here. But what happens in that first time, or that battle, as it starts to unfold, the Confederates are just overrunning the Union forces because they're not prepared, they're not ready. Even though there was some firing going on, they didn't realize it was a full-scale attack. And they get shoved way back. I mean, by the end of the day, on April 6th, they're all the way back here. And really in dire straits. Now the 13th Missouri, it's probably a little hard to see this map, but the 13th Missouri is way up there on the left. That's where their camp is that morning. And they get orders, they're under Wallace, but they get orders to help Sherman out. They're probably closest to Sherman. You know, Wallace was more in the center of the line. So they're up there, and this is kind of, this X here is where that X is there is just a little bit bigger. This is the 9th Illinois here, the 7th Illinois. And so what they're going to do is they're going to go about 1.5 miles to 2 miles south to engage the enemy. And they get the order about 8:15, so it takes them about an hour to get down to where the fight is. And that fight, I kind of switched maps here because the one the guy sent me didn't show it, but it's all the way down there on the left, And that's the further south that the 13th gets. And as they get down there, federal troops are streaming past them, going to the rear. And so they're trying to hold some ground there, but they eventually they start moving back. Just remember, this is when we get later. I'll show you the 13th Missouri Monument. It's located right here on this road, right next to the Confederate burial trenches. So that goes to about 2 p.m. And then they end up going back. They're back up north, pretty close to where their old camp was. It would be right about here, is what by the end of the afternoon, by 3:30 in the afternoon, that's where they're going to end up, and they end up spending the night there. Their camp that they started out after losing, march 2 miles, have to come fight all the way back, is not that far away from where they started. And actually, J. Felix St. James is killed on the first day of fighting. But the second day, by that time, Buell had come in the night of the 6th, and so he's starting to bring reinforcements in. Grant kind of gets his people together and gets them back trying to take ground. So they start pushing the Confederates back and finally push them far enough back that the Confederates retreat to Corinth. So they started out about right here on the night of April 7th or April 6th, and they actually it's the red mark up there. And on the April 7th, they only go a little ways. They go down to the camp of General Carroll Marsh. That's where his camp had been, and so it's really a fairly short distance. And they fought till noon until they ran out of ammunition, and then they were taken off the battlefield. So that was kind of the end of the 13th's involvement in Shiloh. So they're just doing a kind of a short run down that road on Sunday. We do have the battle report of Colonel Crafts right. A couple of things in there. He says the lieutenant colonel, adjutant, sergeant major, 2 captains, and other wounded retired or were barred from the field. And this is what he's writing after the battle, and he kind of describes kind of where they're at. But he says down at the bottom, Lieutenant Colonel St. James was mortally wounded while in his place in line and has since died. So he was hit during that fighting from the retreat from down south back up to the area where they camped for the night. This was a pretty bloody battle, and up to this time, it was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Union casualties about 13,000, about 1,800 killed, 8,000 wounded, about 3,000 captured and missing. So the Union forces kind of took it on the chin here. And they had a lot more soldiers than the Confederates. The Confederate casualties are about 10,500, about the same number killed, about the same number wounded, but a lot less captured. So this was a pretty, as I said up this time, the most bloody battle of the Civil War. The next one was Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, and Gettysburg is the worst, and then Chancellorsville and then this. So it was kind of an eye-opener, I think, for the people. I mentioned the 13th Missouri Monument, which was on that southernmost part of where they were on April the 6th. And I have to say, if you look at the monument, it doesn't say Missouri on top of it. It says Ohio. Because shortly after this, that unit becomes the 22nd Ohio. But this monument was actually built by the Ohio people. And so you can see on the front, the back of it has a little thing. And it says this regiment was detached from its brigade and ordered to report to General Sherman. It engaged here about 11 a.m. 1862. It was driven back to Jonesfield, rallied, and returned to this place where it was engaged until 2 p.m. It had present for duty officers and men 538. Its loss were 10 men killed, 3 officers. There was 67 wounded, 1 man missing. J. Felix was pretty unlucky. I mean, was only having 10 people killed and having your lieutenant colonel being one of them. There is also a Missouri monument down at Shiloh in the shape of the state, and it lists the various groups, and you can see the 13th Missouri is listed there. This is a list of all the different Missouri units, including Confederate units that fought at the Battle of Shiloh. I mentioned that the 13th Missouri becomes the 22nd Ohio, and that was in July of 1862. This picture was taken just a little bit later when they were down in Mississippi, and that is the 22nd Ohio.
They have the Scottish caps on.
The what?
They got some of the Scottish caps on. You see that?
Yeah. This one?
Yeah.
There's one in the middle. Again, I think, you know, that regiment was made up of a bunch of different groups, or different people, areas. After the Battle of Shiloh, they ended up going down and participated in the siege and Battle of Corinth and the expedition to Iuka, Mississippi in 1862, 1863. They're on garrison duty for the Mobile and Ohio Railroad and end up at the siege of Vicksburg and Steele's expedition and capture Little Rock, Arkansas. They spent 1864, the first part, in Searcy, Arkansas, and then later on, I think about October, they were sent back to Camp Dennison, Ohio, and were mustered out in November of that year. Some of the people formed a new group at that time and fought until 1865, but that was really the end of what we consider the 13th Missouri / 22nd Ohio. One of the interesting things I found was a newspaper article where Colonel Crafts Wright, who actually during the Civil War, after the Battle of Shiloh, he was accused of failing to obey orders twice for his efforts during that day on April 6th. And actually, I think he was saved because Sherman wrote this really nice report and said that those men fought gallantly, even though, you know, there's lots of retreating going on. Crafts Wright was supposedly wounded. Later on, the President Lincoln nominated him to be a general, but he resigned in September of that year. I think he saw the handwriting on the wall that there was going to be a board of inquiry. But he ends up living, he's a newspaper editor in Cincinnati. He ends up moving to Chicago. But he was actually a West Pointer, graduated in the class of 1828, and he ends up donating the flag, the battle flag for the 13th Missouri to the museum at West Point. And I've written them to ask if they still have it, and do they have a picture of it. Supposedly has a cannonball hole through it. And there was a young boy named Bean who was, and it kind of explains it in the article, that Bean took this flag when they're, you know, getting overrun. He wraps it under his clothing and everything and saves the flag. And he gets promoted for doing that. But it would really be interesting to get at least a picture of the 13th Missouri battle flag. So, you got something, Gary?
There is a picture of the battle flag.
I wrote the museum. I haven't heard back from them. If you have it, I'd love to see it.
It's in the Ohio State Archives.
Oh, okay, moved it. Okay. So, kind of moving back to J. Felix St. James, he was wounded on April the 6th. He dies April 8th in a hospital in Savannah, Tennessee. There was a hospital in Pittsburgh Landing that they actually Grant lived or stayed there. I think it's called Cherry Point or something like that. But the guy from Shiloh Battlefield sent me this article on medical things during the Civil War, and like when that was happening, the whole town becomes a hospital with as many wounded as they had there. But he dies on April 8th at the hospital, and his body gets transported back to St. Genevieve, and he gets buried on the 14th of April. And he's buried in Memorial Cemetery. We think he's buried next to his father. We don't have a tombstone. And his father's tombstone is down in the southern part of the cemetery, right in the middle. Well, he dies in 1862. His son August dies in 1863. So that just leaves one child, Annie Isabel, living. He's only 19 months and 22 days old. So And then, well, I'm kind of moving forward here a little bit. Annie kind of survives, and Susan Elizabeth survives until after the turn of the century. And then daughter Annie does die in 1904 in St. Louis. By that time, she had married 3 times. The first time was to a guy named Louis Jones, who was actually from New Orleans. And the second husband, I can't remember his name, the third one was Dreyer, and that's why wife of H. Dreyer. I can't find where she's buried in St. Louis, but she's up there someplace. And then Susan dies on May 3rd, 1911. She's still living here in St. Genevieve when she dies, and her will is on file up in the courthouse. Her tombstone is actually out at Valley Springs Cemetery, where where the priest plot is in the middle. It's the next section on the right, just past that. Very, very unassuming tombstone for the fact that her father is Ichabod Sargent and she's married to this J. Felix St. James. But the legacy of St. James goes on because in 1867 they formed the St. Genevieve Post of the GAR, and it's named after J. Felix St. James. So, and that post goes until about 1932, I think. I'm trying to remember when the last guy died. It's somewhere around there. One thing I didn't understand, it says this is when they were installing the first guys. It says, we were unable to describe the gracefulness with which the vets rode the goat. Now, I'm not sure if that was something in the GAR or if that was just a general kind of thing. I don't know that we ever know the initiation, do we, of the GAR? One of the legacies we don't have is that in 1888, his brother gives the GAR group a portrait of J. Felix St. James. And it was said that the likeness is very good. I wonder what happened to that portrait. You know, there's a number of things we'd like to find. We'd like to find the minutes of the GAR. We'd like to find this portrait, obviously. This one picture we do have that is very special is the Decoration Day Parade of 1888. And Mrs. Felix St. James, I believe, is in the carriage back here. The first Decoration Day had 3 people at the cemetery. You can see what the GAR did the next year. Around 1902, and he might have published it earlier, but this is the first time I saw it in the newspaper, his brother Gustavus St. John writes a poem about the Battle of Shiloh. And it's probably 10 stanzas long. And it goes on about the 6th of April, but here he writes about his brother. Among the first and the hottest of the fray, the brave Colonel J.F. St. James, his true Missouri 13th, led the day to face the musket's deadly sins. The assault was met, whence came the mortal blow, as last words forward he did give. He fell, as hero faces foe, and died that his country shall live. His brother did a lot, was pretty poetic, because he wrote several other poems. One's called The Little Stone Church, about the church that was inside of our current brick church before it was torn down. But that's one of the legacies there. And Susan St. James's house is still in existence. Anybody know what that building is? It's the mortuary, Stanton Woods Mortuary. Well, you can see there's a little bit of color difference between this stone and that stone over there. The mortuary was built around the house of Susan St. James there. So I always heard there was a stone building there. If you look on the Sandbarn maps, you'll see it there. So we kind of have a little bit of a house legacy of where Susan lived. One of the other things I've always been interested in, are there any living relatives alive? I've found one for Louis Fields Lynn. I found one for John Scott. And I have found one for a descendant of J. Felix St. James. And it goes down, Annie marries this guy, Louis Jones. We have a picture of him that I got from his great-great-grandson. And Annie has 2 sons, Samuel T. Jones and Sergeant Felix Jones. One of the nice things about English people is they like to keep the family name someplace in there. And makes genealogy. I'd have never found this if it hadn't been for the word sergeant. But Sergeant Felix Jones, Samuel T. ends up having one daughter, Louis Ethel Jones, who dies in 1993 out in Sun City, Arizona. I don't know if she ever had any children or not. Got to end up seeing if I can find her obituary. But Sergeant Felix Jones has a son, only one son, Sergeant Felix Jones Jr., and he has a son named Ian Sergeant Jones. And this is the guy that I found. He is not a Yankee anymore. He lives in Covington, Louisiana, which is north of New Orleans, and he has 3 children, a daughter and 2 twins, Raven and Shelby. And he believes he is the last living, or these are the last living descendants of J. Felix St. James. I've been corresponding with him. He likes our Facebook page for the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. You see a picture pop up that's the Tallahassee or the Florida State football team symbol. That's him. And it was kind of interesting. I finally found his Facebook page, and he mentions, he has a picture of this Louis Jones on there. And then he has a picture of some silver that he has. Well, Becky's got me so much interested in silver. I was reading Susan St. James' will, and she gives pieces of silver to Sergeant Felix Jones. And we think they are still in the family, but they are not A.O., I've already asked, or Antoine O'Neill, or Louis Robitaille, or Louis Capote. But they still have the silver that Susan St. James gave to his grandfather in 1911. And then also we honor J. Felix by his legacy with naming our camp after him. And then every April 8th, we have an honor guard down where we think he's buried, and just to kind of keep his memory alive. And just end this with let us never forget him and the rest of the people that not only fought in the Civil War, but who fought in any war. Right? We've had citizen soldiers from St. Louis die anything from the American Revolution to present-day Afghanistan. And I think it's a credit to our community that our sons and now our daughters take up the banner in defense of our country. So I'll take any questions you might have.
Interesting enough, Bob, is the backing up even before Shiloh, the Missouri 13th, when Grant was chasing them down to Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, down through there. Who was the main Confederate general or anything that was down there? Of course, was Forrest, Nathan Forrest, and the Confederate cavalry group from here in St. Genevieve, which young Lieutenant Chadwell from here in St. Genevieve, he was part of the headquarters group of Forrest, and the 13th Missouri, which was Northern troops, they would have been shooting at probably their cousins from here in St. Genevieve as they were fighting their way down through Fort Donelson and down through there. Forrest and his guys, and I do have, the diary of Chadwell, and he tells about Forrest escaping through the swamps. He was the one that got away, that they didn't overrun and at Fort Donelson, Fort Henry, down through there. The group, Forrest's group, they escaped through the swamps down there, and of course Forrest went on to be one of the big, Confederate cavalry generals through the Mid-South here. So, but the group from St. Genevieve, they again, the group from St. Genevieve that was with Forrest all through the Civil War. They again shot at each other at Vicksburg. Like a year or two later, they didn't know it at the time, but across the battlefield. Of course, years after it was all over, they finally figured out that where where the guys from St. Genevieve were, and where from the Confederate group with Forrest, and where the guys from the North, that they would have been shooting at each other across the battlefield.
One of the things I mentioned was that Felix's daughter Annie married a guy named Lewis Jones, who was from New Orleans. Well, it turns out that Ian Sergeant Jones' grandfather on the Jones side fought in the Battle of Shiloh. And he was with something called the Crescent Brigade. And the Crescent Brigade ends up right about here. So one of his ancestors on his dad's side and one of his ancestors on his mom's side might have been fighting each other. It was kind of a strange thing that happened.
Bob, one other thing that I've heard, and it's just, passed me down. What was the reason why Felix changed his name from St. Jim to St. James? I had heard that originally, because he was supposedly the first officer.
He changed it long before that. He changed it in 1851 when remember that I showed this list of lawyers?
Yeah.
He's already St. James.
Okay.
And back then, when lawyers came into town, they had to sign a book up in the courthouse. And his name's in there, and it's St. James.
St. James.
Yeah.
So, what I had heard, and of course this was just, rumor, I guess, that the reason why he changed his name was the St. Jim was too French.
Well,
It had tied in, with Southern, hierarchy, where the St. Jim, or St. James was more English and more northern.
I've
But
heard
that didn't
too,
have
but
anything to do with it.
Well, he might have been, and then he might have been an abolitionist, and did, his father owned slaves, and just, in 1850, he's already St. James.
Yeah.
And we have a slave inventory from 1849, so I mean, it's not that far off. The other part of it is the English part, and a part of it might be that abolitionist. His brother Gustav changes his to St. Jem, G-E-M, instead of the G-E-M-M-E over time. So these things are hard to find out what the real story is, but it's kind of brought him to life a little bit, and I think as we continue to explore, we'll learn more from his great-great-grandson, about that family. So.
Before they were St. Jimmy, they were Beauvais.
Well, that was a nickname.
Beauvais.
It would be D.
But it's
Beauvais.
all the same family.
It's all the same family. Yeah.
Some of them went by Beauvais, some of them went by St. Jimmy, and then he went by St. James.
Yeah. The like Vital St. Jean Beauvais, down on the corner down here, I think he would have been a cousin to this St. Jim. I haven't found out where he lived.
Vital was a brother to Jean Baptiste. Jean-Baptiste
and Vital were brothers,
yes.
right. J.B. Beauvais is what he went by, was the owner of the Beauvais Amarillo House. And Vital was his brother, I guess. I haven't figured out where he lived exactly yet. Or 1860, he's living with a bunch of farmers. And I need to look at the other people on the census and see where their property was. It's really hard looking at land records to see if he bought anything, because he was a lawyer, and you see all these deeds, and there's a party of the first part, a party of the second part, and a party of the third part. He's the party of the third part, and I guess they're passing documents and money around, so it's really hard to narrow down exactly what he is, but that's one of the things I want to try to find out. Where did he live here in St. Genevieve?
Do you know any information on the wounds that he suffered, or what caused his death ultimately?
I've never seen anything on that. Have you, Gary? Just said he was mortally wounded.
Was that a battle report that was post-war?
That was or Kraft J. Wright's battle report after the Battle of Shiloh. Yeah. And, you know, I got a really good a synopsis from the historian at Shiloh. They actually had a battlefield commission afterwards where they brought people in and discussed where everybody was at and all of this. And that's where a lot of the myths of Shiloh kind of got put to rest. Usually, and what this guy says is when you look at battle reports, people get confused as to time and place very easily in the order of battle. So they try to work through that. I mean, some of them have him even going further south down to the Purdy Road, and it just doesn't, from people afterwards in the battlefield commission, it just doesn't jive.
It's a beautiful park. If you've ever been there, it is one of the most
it's really
beautiful
neat.
national parks I think that we have.
I have pictures of all the 13th Missouri signs that they have posted at these various locations where they were at.
Yeah, very clearly marked to go there. It's really easy to get turned around though, because I sympathize any soldier that was on foot. I mean, there's place markers down there with arrows pointing me this way, pointing that way. I still got turned around in the place.
Go down in the fall, you know,
Yeah.
when the leaves are off the trees, and
Yeah.
that's when I went down and actually walked through the hills, and it's really, you can, if you got a battlefield map, you know, during the fall, you can really see, you know, where the different positions and stuff were.
In April, it would have been tough.
Yeah.
Yeah, with all the underbrush and everything.
This is actually a monument map for Shiloh, as opposed to a battle map. And all of these, they have little numbers on here. There's A's and M's and stuff like that. And there's an index where you can go to and look up where all of these, like you look up 13th Missouri and it'll list all the monuments and battle locations. So if you wanted to trace an individual unit, you can do it very easily. I guess Grant turned disaster into success of this battle. And, we lost a member of St. Genevieve in the battle.
He was pretty much relieved right after this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, Hurlbut and Wallace were also sent to the reserves after that, and Wallace got a command back later. And Prentice, I mentioned him. He gets involved in the center of the line here, and the Confederates kind of in what's called the Battle of the Sunken Road and the Hornet's Nest. It was must have been a very terrible battle. I mean, they are just pounding each other, and he gets encircled by the Confederates, and they end up having to surrender part of that unit. But again, he got credit for the early warning when he was mad at Peabody for actually going out and doing the reconnaissance.
And this was before Drunken Sherman started his rise to fame. I mean, this was one of the early battles that Sherman was really starting to rise.
I think what saved Kraft Wright's Fanny was Sherman's endorsement of him after the battle.
And that he was a drinking buddy of Grant's.
It didn't say that. Okay. Well, thank you.